Good afternoon. It's nice to be with the ICC as well as the Daily FT, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I cannot join with your program on a live basis, and that's why at Dinesh's request and invitation I'm doing this recording early so that I can send it across to you so that you can use it at the seminar itself. The program today is one where you are discussing the impact of Forex crisis and solutions for the national economy. In that context, I think it's useful for us to understand how this challenge has actually commenced and come to being. If you look at the past, you would find that by the end of 2014, Sri Lanka had a GDP of $79 billion and the total international sovereign bonds outstanding was just $5 billion. It was around 6%. However, by the end of 2019, we found that the ISPs had increased up to $15 billion, although the GDP had increased only to around $84 billion. Now, therefore, the total content of the ISPs as a percentage of the GDP had risen to a very high level, which meant that the strain on the economy was somewhat strong, and then that had to be addressed very, very carefully. In the meantime, immediately after that, we were faced with the COVID, and that put an even greater strain on the economy with foreign inflows coming from by way of tourism receipts being almost reducing to zero. As we know, in the year 2019, we had around $4.5 billion being the inflow of foreign exchange into the country per year from tourism. And for 2 years, when that does not come in, we have a gap of around $9 billion that we had to deal with. So those compounded this situation, and although there has been a lot of efforts to deal with it, there had been a few other changes that had to be made in the economy as well in order to accommodate that situation. If you look at the debt situation, we saw that by the end of 2019, our reserves had been, or rather by about November 2019, at the time when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa took office, the reserves were around $7,642 billion. Although, if you really look at it, by the end of 2014, we had about $8 billion, and thereafter there were borrowings of around at least $10 billion that came in through international sovereign bonds, which would have suggested that our total should have been more than that. But unfortunately, we had only about $7.6 billion as the total of reserves. Now, utilizing those reserves as well as the other inflows, Sri Lanka had been able to pay by the end of 2021 a total of $12,443 million. And even thereafter, you would find that the reserves had come down to $3,138 million, which meant that there has been a net payment of around $7,939 million, approximately $7.9 billion, which had been paid out of the inflows that had come into the country. So this fallacy that if you don't have reserves, you cannot pay the debt, and therefore you'll be having a bankrupt scenario, is really not one that can be sustained. So having said that, let's see what has taken place in the recent past. If we did look at the situation, you would find that Sri Lanka had its reserves reducing to a great extent. And by the end of the third quarter of 2021, it had reduced to about $2,481 million. But at that time, there were many who were skeptical and who said that the reserves are not sufficient to make the next international sovereign bond payment as well. Now, in that context, that itself put a lot of pressure on the foreign exchange, and many people were very concerned as to whether Sri Lanka would be able to make ends meet, and that added to the tension with regard to the foreign exchange situation. Nevertheless, the government and the central bank were able to manage that situation, and we found that by the end of 2021, the reserves had risen to $3.1 billion, when many people projected the reserves to be in the range of about $1.5 billion only, and thereafter Sri Lanka would default on the debt which was due on the 18th of January 2022. Now, what happened? There were many people who first said Sri Lanka won't be able to make this payment, and because that payment cannot be made, that there would be several repercussions that would follow. The country would be bankrupt, the country would be not able to pay its debt, no supplies would come into the country, not only the sovereign bonds as well as other international payments will not be made, but local payments also will stop, because there won't be any new investments into the treasury bills and treasury bonds, and that there will be complete chaos with the banking sector also in disarray. But we were able to go through that situation and make the necessary changes, and we found that we were in a position to meet that payment and to continue. But when that was done, and when an announcement was made that the payment was going to be done, the same people who were saying that Sri Lanka will not be able to make this payment, and that because of that there will be all these repercussions to follow, then changed the chorus. I'm sorry to say this, they changed the chorus and then started saying Sri Lanka shouldn't pay the debt, and that we should find some alternative way in moving forward. Now that I thought was very strange, but fortunately the government and the central bank stood firm, and we went across and paid the dues, and now we have a stable situation that we are now faced with and we are moving forward with. Now in that context, we found that had we not paid, what would have happened? Most probably the newspapers would have had banners, headlines saying that Sri Lanka has defaulted for the first time in 73 years, and that as a result of that, these payments now would stop, and all these other terrible things that were going to happen would happen. And what is even more significant is that there was a treasury bill auction the next day, which was for 97 billion rupees, and that would have very likely have not been subscribed as well, which would have meant that the central bank would have had to subscribe, or the government would have had to say we are not going to pay the local bills as well. So these would have been the repercussions, and that would have had tremendous repercussions on the banking sector and the financial system stability, and that is why sometimes, although on the face of it and one or two indicators would suggest that there is going to be some advantage in not doing something or doing something, you got to understand that in an economy you have to look at all these parameters before a decision is being taken, and now Sri Lanka can move forward with a lot more clarity and confidence as we go on. Now for the future, we would have to ensure that tourism is maintained. Already we can see some signs of tourism coming back to normalcy. Exports are holding firm and exports are strong. We have seen a reduction in the remittances, which is now being addressed, and a lot of work is being done in order to ensure that the remittances would increase for the future as well, and we have given many incentives as well. And in the current shortfall of certain payments that have been experienced, particularly in the light of very high imports that are taking place in the country with the development as well, we would see some shortages, but I believe that in time to come, those also would ease with new inflows coming in. Now, at the same time, the government has taken a conscious decision that our exposure to the international sovereign bonds would be reduced gradually. In fact, now it has reduced to $12.5 billion from the $15 billion that was there by the end of 2019. And we would gradually reduce that with swaps in the short term and with non-debt inflows like monetization of certain assets in the longer term, and it is already happening. There are a lot of transactions being now discussed as well. And we would find that as time goes on, there would have been a gradual reduction of the ISPs, and then we would have a greater ability to absorb the interest costs as well as the repayment of those debts into an economy that is growing even more in time to come. So basically, the strategy would be a kind of a restructuring. Now, a lot of people think that restructuring means you got to go to the IMF or go to somebody else and then inflict pain on your creditors and have a big change in the way you deal with your creditors, and that would be the restructure. But if you talk to any banker, you will find that many banks restructure the loans of their clients by giving a longer period of time or giving a different interest rate or changing the mix of the loan, and that itself is also part of restructuring. Now, what Sri Lanka is doing now is to change the manner in which our debts are structured so that it will become easier for us to manage the debt as well. What have we done? We have made sure that some of the debts that are from international sovereign bonds are paid off with swap arrangements that we have done with individual countries, which have come at a much lower cost than the international sovereign bonds as well. There would be a period of around 2 to 3 years that we have in order to find additional inflows that would replace it, as well as other new inflows through non-debt inflows that we can then use in order to retire the swaps. So it's a type of arrangement where we are moving forward with a proper plan, and that plan is the plan that we have already announced on the 1st of October as the roadmap of the central bank from 1st of October to 31st of March. I hear sometimes people saying, where is the plan? The plan is in the website of the central bank. We have given it ample publicity. I know Nissa himself had given quite a lot of publicity to our plan in his newspaper, and in all the newspapers it has been there. People who have an interest in that subject could read that up. So the plan is there. The solutions are also set out, and those solutions are the solutions that we are sticking to and moving forward with diligence to ensure that these are done. So I think we all would be the first to acknowledge that there is a tension, that there is a challenge, particularly because of the global conditions that have put a lot of people into that situation. We do see the prices of commodities rising tremendously. The US is experiencing its highest inflation in 40 years. Australia is having shortages as well as experiencing high inflation. Europe is having high inflation, sometimes the highest in 30 years. So we are no different. We are also facing that challenge, and when going forward, we will also have to deal with that challenge as well. So the plan that we have put in place is to ensure that there would be greater stability brought in, and at the same time a great amount of new inflows also to be encouraged. So Sri Lanka is on the road to recovery. We are seeing growth back at a level of around 5% that we have envisaged for this year. And notwithstanding what the World Bank as well as some other international agencies have said, our homework is very clear. We find that there are many steps that will lead us to that higher growth trajectory, and we would have that growth. So what I would like to emphasize is that Sri Lanka is experiencing a turmoil of sorts which other countries have also experienced, and many countries have experienced it even greater than ours. But we are dealing with every single challenge, and in time to come, we would see the tensions waning and Sri Lanka would be back on track for a higher growth as well as greater stability. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm afraid I cannot stay on for the quick Q&A as well as the other speeches that are going to be made by the others. But I wish this conference all success, and I want to particularly thank as well as congratulate both Dinesh and Nista for organizing a conference and a seminar of this nature so that we can all express our views and give our thoughts so that we can together make Sri Lanka grow as well as ensure that Sri Lanka retains its stability in time to come as well. Thank you very much.